So let us continue our little reading session. And next thing in line is again Cahn's introduction by Joshua Cohen to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Cohen is also a Rousseau scholar. I don't think that Cohen is actually referenced in Boucher, but I think I've come across the name in several places. Anyway, but let's look at the text. So, Jean-Jacques Rousseau was born in Geneva. His mother died 2 days after his birth, and his father, a watchmaker, fled when Rousseau was 10. Again, an interesting situation similar to Hobbes. Rousseau grows without a father. Freudians will make a lot of this, no doubt. Anyway, raised by his uncle, Rousseau left Geneva at the age of 16 and eventually settled in Paris in the early 1740s. Despite the geographic separation, Rousseau maintained a strong public identification with Geneva throughout much of his life. He came to intellectual maturity in absolutist France, in debate with the leading thinkers of the French Enlightenment. In debate. Debate with the leading thinkers of the French Enlightenment. So Rousseau is both a thinker of the Enlightenment and a critic of the Enlightenment. Anyway, but the image of Geneva as a small, self-governing republic in which the people are sovereign and all citizens are subject to law continued to provide political bearings. Rousseau's political bearings, I would imagine. Whereas Rousseau's early experience in Geneva inspired his political thought, his theory of human nature came to him later in a flash as he walked from Paris to Vincennes in 1749. He was on the way to visit Diderot, then imprisoned in the Chateau of Vincennes. Reflecting on a question set by the Academy of Dijon, has the restoration of the sciences and the arts contributed to the purification of morals? Rousseau was overtaken, he says, by a flood of ideas, 1,000 lights. Lying at the heart of this sudden inspiration was the thought that dominated his subsequent writing, that man is naturally good, and that it is solely by institutions, by human institutions, that men become wicked. And as Boucher adds, society corrupts man, but paradoxically only society can redeem him. This conception of natural goodness, an alternative to the Augustinian doctrine of original sin and the Hobbesian theory of human nature, so we can, I think, quite legitimately see and call Rousseau an anti-Augustinian in some sort. Again, Augustine believes that human beings are naturally infected by sin. Rousseau thinks that human beings by nature are good. Anyway, as Rousseau explained to Archbishop Beaumont of Paris, is the fundamental principle of all morals and the basis of all my writings, the fact of goodness of human nature, and the corruption through human institutions. Although unified by this fundamental idea, Rousseau's principal writings on human nature and politics fall into three groups. His early critical essays, Discourse on the Arts and Sciences, and the Discourse on the Origin of Equality, which we are reading, and letters to Monsieur d'Alembert on the theatre. So in these three works, he challenges the Enlightenment views that the advance of sciences and understanding has improved the human condition, making human life freer, happier, and more virtuous. So no, the advance of science does not improve human condition and does not make human life freer, happier, and more virtuous. I think there's an important parallel between what Rousseau is saying here and what Marx is later going to say. But a disanalogy, for example, with Hegel and maybe with Hobbes even. So Hegel is not a pessimist in this Rousseauian sense of the term. Anyway, so Rousseau rejects this complacent view and reveals a darker side to the intellectual progress. Connecting enlightenment with the evolution of constraint, unhappiness, and vice, he explains how human beings, though naturally good, have become corrupted. His more positive writings, this is the second group, his more positive writings of the social contract, Emile, and the best-selling novel The New Eloise, Letters from the Mountain, and Constitutional Proposals for Corsica, some of you recognize an important name, and the Constitutional Proposal for Poland, present a scheme of political institutions and a program of education that would cure our political condition, restoring freedom through virtue and providing us with a life suited to our nature. So again, three groups of writings. First one critical, second one proposes solutions. Third, in his autobiographical confessional writings, including his Confessions, Reveries of Solitary Worker, and Rousseau, Juge de Jean-Jacques, all published after Rousseau's death, he testifies to his own authenticity, insisting that he has not been caught up in the web of deception, hypocrisy, and manipulation that defines conventional society. These writings, though intensely personal and self-revealing, also present a universal, if you want, cosmopolitan message. Rousseau's own uncorrupted sincerity is the evidence of humanity's natural goodness and illustrates the possibility of extricating ourselves from our self-imposed misery and vice. So when I say that Rousseau could probably considered himself to be a legislator, yeah, this is one corroborating indirect evidence. Rousseau's political philosophy describes the terms of this extrication, so this, salvation, if you want. The fundamental political problem, he says, and this is crucially important, you should know this by heart. The fundamental political problem, he says, is to find a form of association that defends and protects the person and goods of each associate with a full common force, and by means of which each one, uniting with all, nevertheless obeys only himself and remains as free as before. The importance of this problem reflects the central role in our nature of self-love and freedom. Because we love ourselves, we cannot be indifferent to the security of our persons and goods. But not just any form of protection will do. Say hi to Hobbes. So not any form of protection will do. For Hobbes, seemingly any form of protection is better than nothing. For Rousseau, not so. Not any form of protection will do for Rousseau. We are born free, with a capacity to choose and to regulate our own conduct. This capacity is the source of humanity's special worth, our standing as moral agents who can make claims on others and take responsibility for our conduct. Freedom is so fundamental that renouncing one's liberty is renouncing one's dignity as a man, the rights of humanity, and even its duties. So we must find a form of security that does not demand such renunciation, which does not demand, in other words, us to sacrifice our freedom. So again, the charge of totalitarianism is laid at the door of both Rousseau and Hegel, and in fact, our readings talk about how for both Rousseau and Hegel, freedom is of paramount importance. Not so for Hobbes, by the way. Of the social contract du contrat social, presents Rousseau's solution, a political society that achieves a harmony of obedience and freedom. In this society, obedience to authority does not require a subordination of will that denies our freedom and corrupts our sensibilities. The proposed harmony is puzzling. How could each person accept political authority, thus uniting with all for common security, while obeying only himself or herself, achieving the moral freedom that consists in giving the law to oneself and so remaining as free as before? So, question. Rousseau's explanation has two components corresponding to two kinds of doubt about the possibility of such a political society. Doubts about content and motivation. So the first one. The problem of content arises because accepting authority, which is required for security, appears to involve letting oneself be ruled by the decisions of others, perhaps the majority. To show that self-government can be reconciled with the chains of social connection and the bonds of political authority, we need some way to dispel this appearance, to show that the idea of such reconciliation is even coherent. Rousseau's conception of a society guided by a general will addresses this problem. In such a society, the political obligations of citizens are fixed by laws. Those laws reflect a shared understanding of the common good, and that understanding expresses an equal concern for the good of each citizen. Because the content of the conception of the common good reflects an equal concern with the well-being of each citizen, the society provides security for the person and goods of all, of each. Because citizens share in this conception and it is embodied in law, each citizen remains free in fulfilling legal obligations. Those obligations are acceptable to citizens as free agents because each can regard the obligation to the common good as self-imposed. So not imposed from outside, but self-imposed. Again, this phrase from Rousseau, that freedom is the obedience to the law that one has prescribed to oneself. Back to the text. Rousseau's solution to the fundamental problem requires then that the parties to the social contract treat each other as equals, both in the institution of equal citizenship and regulating conduct by reference to reason of the common good. Again, equality is important for Rousseau, but not in itself, but as an instrument for securing freedom. I think this is a very important point, again, that freedom is the real political value. Equality is valuable only instrumentally. To institutionalize and sustain the supremacy of the general will, Rousseau proposes a system of non-representative, direct democracy. Citizens themselves are to assemble regularly to affirm their social bonds, evaluate the performance of the executive, and choose the fundamental laws that will best advance their common good. So even though, I remind you, even though for Rousseau different forms of government are possible, including elective aristocracy, for example, still, in the legislative sense, the sovereign cannot be represented, the sovereignty cannot be represented, but has to be embodied by the collective direct participation of all the citizens. In the extreme cases, maybe some form of tacit consent is appropriate, but still, it is important that at least under the ideal conditions, I remind you that Rousseau talks about these periodic meetings that have to take place where every member of the sovereign, which is to say every citizen, can be present and can speak, and the two motions, whether we want to retain the present form of government and whether we want to retain the people who occupy the executive positions in the government. Legislative authority cannot be delegated. Anyway, let's continue. So, the first objection, I remind you, was to the content. The second one to motivation. So the second objection. Even if we grant, however, that society of the general will solves the content problem, we may still wonder whether such an ideal society is a human possibility. It requires, after all, a shared conception of and allegiance to the common good. But widespread vice, selfishness, pride, jealousy, envy naturally prompts the thought that this ideal is inconsistent with human motivation. Hobbes would certainly have rejected Rousseau's view for this reason. Serving what he would have called serving what he called known and natural inclinations of mankind, Hobbes found desires for individual preservation and happiness. He noted the strength of human fears about violent death. He observed, at least in some people, passions of pride, jealousy, and envy rooted in a sense of natural difference of worth and a concern that relative social standing mirror those presumptively natural differences. This is Hobbes. And Hobbes, found that people are often blinded by passion into acting for near-term advantages and against their own long-term interest. Departing from these observations, Hobbes, concluded that we need a sovereign with unconditional authority, nothing less would suffice, whose power is sufficient to overawe subjects, tame their pride with fear, King Leviathan, the king of the children of pride, and ensure the social peace required to protect human life and happiness. Hobbes' defense of political submission is driven, in short, by his general pessimism about human capacities for self-regulation. More particularly, he was skeptical about the motivational power of reason, of the common good, because he did not see human beings as moved by a concern to treat others as equals. Concerned with preservation and happiness, we have at most an instrumental concern with equality. Insofar as we are prone to pride, we will reject equality as inconsistent with our naturally superior worth and an insult to our dignity. Interesting again. Yeah. So this idea, maybe that sort of pride, what Rousseau calls amour propre, is indeed the prime passion that stops us, that blocks us from compacting a true social contract, and instead force us to live in this swindle of an evil contract. Anyway, back to the text. Rousseau's case for the motivational possibility of a general will and the political autonomy it makes possible would have been simpler had he rejected Hobbes' psychological observations. But Rousseau found little basis for disagreeing with Hobbes' dismal description. Men are wicked, Rousseau agreeing with Hobbes. Men are wicked, agreeing with Hobbes, Rousseau says in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, adding that a sad and constant experience makes proof unnecessary. We observe widespread vice, and underlying that vice can discern a frenzy to distinguish ourselves, an ardent desire to raise one's relative fortune less out of genuine need than in order to place oneself above others. This frenzy and desire, in turn, have roots in an inflated, false sense of self-worth. So amour propre, right? Struck by differences of social station, we fail to see that man is the same in all stations. This description naturally prompts the pessimistic thought that the society of general will is incompatible with human motivations, that human nature has no place for the commitment to equality and the common good required for political autonomy. And if we could directly infer intrinsic properties of human nature from observed motivations, if, for example, the ardent desire for advantage over others were an original predisposition, or the inflated sense of self-worth an original sentiment, that pessimistic thought would be true, and we would be compelled to reject the possibility of a political society in which citizens give law to themselves. But, and here's the crucial notion, right? But we are not required to accept the direct inference and therefore not required to draw the pessimistic implications. That is the point of Rousseau's second discourse. It presents, as Rousseau describes, a genealogy of vice. The point of that genealogy is to turn back an argument that begins with a sad and constant experience of human vice, that attributes such vice to a natural desire uh, sorry, yeah. The point of that genealogy is to turn back an argument that begins with a sad and constant experience of human vice that attributes such vice to a natural desire for advantage or a naturally exaggerated sense of our own worth, and that ends by rejecting as unrealistic an ideal of free association among equals. Rousseau's strategy is to explain all human vice in terms of social circumstance without postulating any original predisposition to it, to vice. So to a more proper, if you want. Although human beings, well, although that's a complicated story, is a more proper natural? Is it only activated by society? I don't want to go into this right now. Anyway, although human beings are naturally good, this is important. So even though they're actually bad, they are naturally good and therefore redeemable, perfectible. The experience of social inequality encourages the desire for advantage and inflamed sense of self-worth that produces constraint, vice, and misery. Rousseau's explanation, then, constitutes a defense of human nature, and that defense permits us to hope, with reason, for a society whose members respect one another as equals, and in doing so, respond to the demands of self-love and freedom. So, of amour de soi, I would imagine, and freedom. And that's it. Again, hoping this was useful, and signing off.